Goeiemiddag aan al die Nampo-gangers. Baie welkom. Dit is regtig vir ons as Investec so lekker vandag saam met julle te kan kuier. Ek net kyk wanneer hy sal opkom. Enetjie terug. Dis hy. As jy vir my die vraag sou vra, Lise Marie, wat weet jy van landbou en van boerdery af? Gaan ek baie eerlik moet bieg en sê dat my kennis is maar 'n bietjie beperk. Ek het in die Vrystaat groot geword, ek het 'n klomp vriende wat boere is in daardie gemeenskap, en my swaar is 'n prokureur van beroep, maar on the sideline het hy eintlik 'n skaapboerdery. So op ons familie WhatsApp groep is ek besig om baie te leer van skaapboerdery as ook wolgradering. Mind you, hulle het al 'n klein lammetjie gehad wat in die huis by hulle kom bly het, want die een se ma is oorlede, en nou Hansie, kom ek sê, hy het op die bank gesit en op die bed geslaap. So dit is die slotsom van my kennis oor boerdery. So julle wonder seker vandag, Liesemarie, wat het jy dan om vir ons vandag oor te kom gesels? Die kort en die lank is dat ons kliënte is entrepreneurs, nes julle. Hulle bou en bestuur besighede, net soos julle. Hulle het strukture, trusts, maatskappye, net soos julle. En dan het hulle ook families, en soos julle weet, met kinders is daar altyd kompleksiteit, want die ene wil graag voor in die toekoms in die besigheid bly en werk, en die ander wil niks met die besigheid te doen hê nie. En dan besluit kinders ook natuurlik om te immigreer en in die buiteland te gaan bly. Alles ekstra probleme wat arme ma en pa aan moet dink wanneer hulle beplanning doen. So hopelik, met daardie ervaring en kennis, kan ons vandag met julle kom deel. Nou, ons gaan praat oor strukturering. So, hoe struktureer ons die volgende, kom ons sê 30 minute van julle lewens, is ons gaan begin met, julle gaan na my luister. Hierdie gesprek gaan wel in in Engels wees, omrede, dit is maar eintlik net vir opname doeleindes, en daarna gaan ons geleentheid gee vir vrae. En as jy 'n vraag in Afrikaans vra, sal ons hom antwoord in Afrikaans. In Engels, as jy bietjie daai Engels wil afstof en weer wil kyk of jy nog daai taal kan praat, voel vry, ons beantwoord hom met liefde in Engels. So, ek sien julle klaar glasie wyn, die van julle. So kom ons begin met ons gesprek. How to structure your estate one sip at a time. So my name is Lise Marie Brink, and I am part of the Investec tax and fiduciary team. We realize that our clients are really becoming international. Not only do they have assets offshore, and locally, but also they've got children that obviously are starting to live and emigrate to jurisdictions abroad. And the moment that you start playing or operating between the cross borders, there's a lot of extra complexities that arise from a tax, exchange control, and an estate planning perspective. And that's what we do. We help our clients to navigate these complexities. So today, that's why you've got wine in your hands. We are doing a proper wine tasting, but not with wine, but with concepts. And the concepts we're going to condense into small sip sizes. If you want to have more information, feel free at any stage to come and chat to me afterwards. But what are we going to be talking about? We're going to talk about diversification of your assets. We are going to talk about the externalisation of funds. Also, how to invest offshore, and this is going to be a discussion kind of with a structuring cap on. And last but not least, we are going to talk about succession planning. So if you are ready to start, let's start sipping on the first topic, diversification of your assets. Now, if I need to think about a wine to compare with this type of concept, it's definitely a very good red blend. And I love what it says. Red blends are often made by combining different grape varieties. Each grape contributes its own set of flavors, aromas, and characteristics, building a multi-layer and intriguing experience. Short and the long, blended well together, you have a very well-balanced wine, and the same applies to your assets. So speaking about diversification, what is diversification? Basically, it boils down to a strategy to manage your risk. And if you manage your risk, what do? You actually then protect your assets. So we know that markets, weather patterns, business cycles, they are all ever changing, and therefore diversification is extremely important. Now, most of you are already, most likely, within your own businesses looking at diversification. But today I also want to encourage you to consider maybe diversifying away from your own business and looking at diversification more into the listed space, where you can get exposure to different asset classes, equities, bonds, cash, and property. Why just only stay local? What about investment away from South Africa, meaning having offshore investments? Because then you don't only diversify from a geographical perspective, but you also diversify away from our rand. Now, when you start building a little nest egg for yourself away also from your business, there's two interesting things that come up, some points to ponder. Number one, you get a few more levers to pull from a succession planning perspective. And I'm not going to delve into much detail on this point right now because we're going to touch on it on the end, and I'm going to show you a proper example of how you can use that to your advantage. And secondly, if you build up a little nest egg, let's say with investments offshore, I'm sure as farmers, you often need to think about, do I need to get some funding? You maybe need a small bridging finance. So the big nice thing is you can actually lend against these share portfolios or unit trust portfolios. So again, it's another avenue that can give you access to funds should that be required. Right, that's diversification. Let's start then sampling the topic of externalisation of funds. And why on earth is there a bottle of Chardonnay there? The reason for that is because in 2023, the white wine variant that was exported most in South Africa was the lovely Chardonnay. So why would winemakers want to export their wine? Because the market in South Africa is limited. Now, if we think about investments and you think about the stocks listed on the JSE, it doesn't even make up literally less than 1% of all the international possibilities for investments out there. So yes, our market is limited. Also, you want to get exposure to offshore markets, right? And then there's potential to grow your profits in hard currency. So it does make sense to externalize. Now, what a lot of people sometimes ask is say, I like this idea of externalization, but practically how on earth do I do this? So, as a South African exchange control resident, we have certain exchange control allowances, but maybe I should explain exchange control first. Basically what it is our Reserve Bank controls the in and the outflow of money in and out of South Africa. So there's specific rules. So when you start taking money offshore, you need to play within these rules. Individuals have these offshore allowances that I'm going to talk to you about now, but companies and trusts don't have these allowances. But if you just hang on a little bit, I'm going to show you how your trust and your company, maybe having a bit of lazy cash in it, can still get offshore exposure. But let's start first just talking about the individual. What can we take out of the country and what are the rules? So each South African individual like us, exchange control residents, can take 1 million rand offshore per calendar year, right? So come 1 January, you've got a fresh set of allowance. That 1 million is also called the travel allowance because when you go for that nice holiday overseas, it eats into the 1 million. And something a lot of people don't know is your Netflix subscriptions, right? If you're a big shopper on Amazon, and even if you own an Apple phone, that little Apple subscription, it all eats into this 1 million single discretionary allowance. Now, over and above this 1 million, you can further take up to 10 million rand offshore per calendar year. Now, this 10 million, with the 1 million, you don't need to do really any paperwork. But for this 10 million, you need to apply to SARS for a tax clearance certificate. And that tax clearance certificate, the new name for it is, it's approved international transfer. So that's why we refer to it as an AIT PIN. Now, we sometimes have clients that have utilized their whole 11 million and then a sale of a business happens and suddenly they're sitting with 100 million rands and they say, the rand is looking good, I want to externalize everything in one go. Can I do it? And the answer is yes. If you want to externalize more than 10 million in a calendar year, you will go and apply for that tax clearance, that AIT PIN, and over and above that, you're going to also need to get Reserve Bank approval. Now, all of this sounds amazing and easy, but again, how do you do it practically? So here's the process. If you need to apply for an AIT PIN, you literally log on to your e-filing, or your accountant can do that for you. You log on, and there's a specific little tab that says Approved International Transfer. You click on that, and that will kickstart the application process. What you need to prove to SARS is A, that you're tax compliant, that you've got 3 years assets and liability statement that you can provide them, and also what is the proof of the source of funds. So you need to show them your bank account that has the 10 million rand in it, or your investment portfolio that's got 10 million rands worth of SA assets in there, and that is then the proof of funds. Now, if you want to take more than the 10 million, remember I said you need to apply for an AIT PIN, but on top of that, you also need to apply to the Reserve Bank for approval. Now, how do you do that? That is literally a little application, and you will submit it through your authorized dealer. Now, most banks in South Africa is an authorized dealer, so phone your banker, and they will help you with this process. And once you've got it, the money can fly. We did it for a client the other day for 700 million, and from a Reserve Bank perspective, there was no issues. So it can happen. And then remember I told you about, what about trusts or companies? Or what about an individual that's maybe already used his tax clearance for the year, or that is still waiting for SARS to stop auditing the clients so that they can actually now get their tax clearance certificate. For those clients that want to externalize funds offshore because the rand is getting stronger and stronger, there's something called an asset swap facility. Now, it's not unique to Investec. A lot of financial institutions have this capability. And what that literally is it's the Reserve Bank has given financial institutions this institutional allowance to take money offshore for clients. There's rules. Oh, just a point on asset swap. Each institution's asset swap is structured a bit differently. Some are structured on balance sheet, some are structured off balance sheet. So just make sure that you understand how the one work that you are doing your transaction through. Anything that sounds too good to be true must always have a little thing that you need to consider. So in the case of asset swap, the investments that you go into must be listed investments. And secondly, if you want to get the money back in your bank account, it must come back to South Africa. It cannot pay to your offshore bank account, and you cannot go buy that house in Portugal with these funds. It must go into listed as investments, and it has to come back to South Africa if you want to have it in your bank account. But this is something where Investec's got a very nifty little capability, and we call it the back-to-back. So as soon as that client's tax clearance or AIT PIN comes in, right, and he says, I've got all this money now in asset swap, here's my tax clearance or my AIT PIN for 10 million, Investec does a back-to-back transaction where we basically do two currency trades simultaneously. And when they settle, it unwinds the asset swap, and then your assets are fully externalized. And once they are fully externalized with your offshore allowances, then you can go buy your house in Spain or Portugal, or let the funds pay to your Lloyd's bank account in the UK. Item number 3, how to invest offshore. And the wine that popped into mind when I thought about this topic is Chateau Palmer. Who in the audience know of Chateau Palmer? Nobody. Okay, it's a beautiful wine farm in the Bordeaux region in France. This is a very lovely red blend. And I think this farm has kind of been in existence since about 1814 when Mr. Palmer purchased the property. And from there on, this wine farm, that's where it originated from. Now, I love the saying that I've put on the screen. It says, and this comes straight from their website, after being captured in the bottle, Palmer's wine is still in the early stages of its life. It can age for years and decades before it finally unveils the full scope of its aromatic richness and complexity. So this is not a bottle of wine that you're buying now to drink tomorrow. This is a wine that you're buying now to drink in a couple of years' time. And I think you should view your offshore investments in that same line. Offshore investments are assets that you are taking offshore now, and it's there to grow over the long term. Furthermore, it says, generation after generation, the teams at Chateau Palmer have devoted their talent, intelligence, and know-how to capturing the subtleties of this legendary terroir. Chateau Palmer is a solid brand with a good reputation. They are expert in the field. They do follow robust decision-making processes, and this is not an experimental wine. This is a wine that was tested through decades and decades of hard work. So, the jockey that's going to take your horse over the line offshore, make sure that it's got a good reputation and a lot of these same qualities that Chateau Palmer has. So, from a structuring perspective, how can you look at structuring your assets? First and foremost, the most vanilla is probably just keep it in your own hands. In your own name, you can have that. Another option is considering an offshore wrapper. Some are sinking funds, the others are endowments. There's a bit of a difference, and there's an education piece around the pros and cons of each, but they have kind of the same properties at the end of the day. What that is that you become the owner of a policy where the asset sits on the balance sheet of the life assurance company. And this offshore wrapper can also have some estate planning tools that you can use to your advantage, and we'll get to that now. And then the other one to consider is an offshore trust. Now, offshore trusts, normally the law is Jersey, and then it can be administrated by a professional trustee sitting in jurisdictions like Switzerland, Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, Mauritius. Normally we say to clients, don't consider offshore trust if you don't have at least 1.5 to 2 million pounds. So what's that? Roughly about like 40 million rand. And the reason for it is these offshore trusts can be expensive. So if you've got sufficient funds in there, the growth on the assets are normally quite enough to pay for those, to cover the costs so that you don't eat into your capital. So that's just high level the options. Now let's dig in a little bit deeper. Own name, having your investments in your own name, that's normally where we say, if you don't have any assets offshore, start there. That's how you slowly get into the swimming pool and figure out how to swim, right? That's where you get a feel for it, and thereafter you can start getting a bit more fancier with other structures. Own name investments, it's easily redeemable. A farmer friend of mine said to me the other day, Lise Marie, if my funds are offshore, how quickly can I get it if I need it back in South Africa? And I think it's about 5 working days. You should be able to get it back, depending obviously on the institution. Remember I spoke earlier about you can use these assets as security for a loan. If those assets are in your own name, you can go to the bank and ask them if they would be willing to use that as security. Other considerations, remember, as South African tax residents, we're taxed on a worldwide basis. So if your assets in your own name, you're not going to run away from ongoing income tax and capital gains, and all of those assets will form part of your estate from an estate duty perspective. Remember I said earlier, once you start crossing borders, you must be careful for certain things, and one of those is CITES. Now, CITES is actually, what it is it's just offshore death taxes. So maybe I can explain it by saying, if I go and I buy shares, Apple shares and Amazon shares. Apple and Amazon is a company that is where? Situated in the United States. The United States levy a death tax when you pass away. And by virtue of the fact that you, even though you're a South African tax resident, own an asset that is situated in a country that levies death taxes, it could have an impact on your estate as well. So when you start investing offshore, there are ways to invest to kind of get out of this situs problem. We are helping a lot of our clients that have these issues at the moment to kind of get rid of the problem. So there are ways to actually correct this and rather not have that offshore detrimental exposure as well. Just quickly, when you pass away, your will would go to the master's office and the master will issue a letter of executorship, and that is the golden document that your executor would need to start administrating your estate. Offshore, it's called a grant of probate. So when you have offshore investments, you need to also have a discussion with your financial institution and find out what offshore grants of probates might be required, because your will might need to go through resealing processes. And then last but not least, one must always have a cap on, sorry, not last but not least on the presentation, but just for this aspect, is that upon your passing, assets in your own name, all those accounts may be frozen, bank accounts, investment accounts, etc. So you always need to think about the people left behind. If all the assets in your family is on your name, what will happen to create liquidity for your spouse? So this is something you need to look out for when you invest in your own name. Now, these offshore wrappers or endowments, why they are quite a nifty thing. And again, horses for courses. Some people need this, some people don't. But something that's great about the offshore wrapper is that you can nominate beneficiaries. And then what happens upon your passing, these assets, and depending on whether it's a sinking fund or endowment, either the asset or the proceeds will roll over straight to the beneficiary. So it doesn't get captured and frozen in this whole estate administration process. And this is a nice way, if liquidity is an issue in your estate planning, to make sure that an asset can go across to your spouse and he or she can live off that to provide liquidity until this whole estate gets wound up. With the wrappers, all that you need to look out for as well is naturally there's a cost involved, and also there could be a little bit of balance sheet risk, because remember the asset sits on the balance sheet of the life assurance company. So that's just something that you need to look at and discuss with a provider. From an offshore trust perspective, offshore trust can be an amazing succession planning tool. If an offshore trust is structured correctly in the right jurisdiction, and very importantly from a South African perspective, it's funded in the correct manner, you can have a vehicle in which all the tax, there's absolutely no tax inside the trust. And that means that all those assets can grow unhindered of any tax drag. There is a bit of tax leakage. Where does that come in? Well, depending on how you funded it, the most vanilla way to probably fund an offshore trust is via an interest-bearing loan. So the interest on that loan, you will obviously be taxed in South Africa because we're SA taxpayers and it will form part of our income tax. And then if you are a South African beneficiary of the trust and a distribution is made from the trust to you, depending on the type of distribution, you will be taxed. If the trust is distributing capital gains to you, our capital gains tax rates will apply to you. If they distribute dividends, our dividend rates, 20%, will be applicable, and so you can go forth. Offshore trusts, a lot of our clients have offshore assets, and what do? They make it all in terms of their will to their SA trust. And that means that all those assets would need to come back to to South Africa. So under the right circumstances, considering an offshore trust, you can establish it during your lifetime and fund it during your lifetime. And there's also something called a bottom drawer trust, right? Some people call it a freezer trust. And that is where you create this trust, but it only gets funded upon your death. And that is where your will is drafted correctly to leave these assets to the offshore trust. And a lot when you do minor planning for minor children, that is something that you can start thinking of. Negatives drawbacks on your offshore trust, funding, the costs. The costs can be quite expensive, so you need to look at that. Also, you would need to be comfortable with relinquishing control. So this is not like an SA trust where you can be a trustee on the trust. No, it's properly an independent offshore trustee, because if you're sitting in South Africa making some key commercial decisions, it can drag that beautiful trust that's completely tax-free into the South African tax net. And then, very important, once kids are starting to immigrate and they live offshore, you need to revisit whether this trust is still suitable. Because foreign jurisdictions tax distributions from these type of foreign trusts quite punitively. So you need to go see if it's still suitable. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on the next little aspect, but if you want to talk to me afterwards about it, by all means. These days, we are seeing that a South African trust can actually now make a distribution to an offshore trust. Now, previously, that was never allowed. The Reserve Bank would only allow it in very exceptional circumstances, like when all the beneficiaries of the South African trust have immigrated. Then maybe they will accept it. But now, since about August last year, this has now become a possibility. And this is opening up a whole new world of planning. So if you want to know more, come chat to me about this later. Our last point to discuss, succession planning. And here I want to think about the Meerlust Rubicon. Obviously, a very well-known South African wine. It's also a very good blend. And what this wine is, its aging potential is 10 to 20 years, but your storage conditions are extremely important. Now, a funny little story is my husband actually got a bottle of Meerlust Rubicon probably in 2010, and he said, the day I get engaged, then I will open this with my bride-to-be, which was the lovely me, of course. Then he moved around during that period. So obviously the storage conditions wasn't supreme, probably a lot of temperature fluctuation. And when we got engaged, the ring went onto the finger and we popped the bottle. What happened? It was completely corked, all right? So what has that to do with succession planning? You can be building up these amazing businesses and growing your assets, and letting this work for you. But if you're not going to look at succession planning and your estate planning, that wine might be corked as well. So it's important to look at these things. So I always think an example is the best way to explain the point that I want to bring across. Let's look at this scenario. We've got mom and dad. They've got 3 children. One child lives in South Africa. The other 2 are living abroad, the UK and the US. Their structure looks like this. They've got a South African trust that owns 100% of the shares in the holding company, and it's actually the holding company that owns the farm and owns the operating company where all the farming and business operations are happening in. Mom and dad listened to the advice of diversification, and they did build up a nest egg in their own hands. So they've got offshore, some unit trusts and cash, and they've also got some investments in South Africa. They came to us and said, please can you help me draft a will and look at my estate planning? So what we did is we looked at the family dynamics, we actually analyzed their whole balance sheet, and we analyzed that complete structure. All the financial statements, everything. And when we looked at this and we started thinking about their estate planning, 2 things popped to mind. In their will, they had it that all their offshore assets must come to the SA Trust, all right? And again, when we highlight that to them, because remember we said a SA trust don't have an offshore allowance, right? They didn't like that idea because they've worked hard to externalize those funds every year. And secondly, we said to them, their idea is that when they, on their passing, that the three children benefit equally from both their estate and from the trust. But do you see that 2 children are living abroad? So, for those offshore children to receive distributions from the SA trust is going to be extremely punitive. Why is that? Our tax legislation say that if a SA trust makes a distribution to a non-South African tax resident, the taxation happens in the hands of the trust at those higher rates. So CGT, 36%, income tax, 45%. Now the trust has paid this tax, right? And the distribution ends up in the bank account in the US and the UK. But guess what? HMRC and the IRS says, thank you very much, we are going to tax this distribution as well, according to our tax legislation. Now in the UK, that could be an income tax for you, 45%. And in the US, they've got very, very strict kind of rules when you speak about distributions from a foreign trust. And with interest and penalties, etc., they can take up to 100% of the distribution. They won't take more than 100%, but they can take up to 100%. So can you see? For those 2 children offshore, does make no sense to be a beneficiary of this SA trust, because if not 80%, 100% of that distribution can just disappear into the hands of the taxman. Another problem that you have is, in South Africa, the trust paid the tax. Offshore, the individual paid the tax. So no double taxation agreement is going to provide you with relief. And why? Because it's 2 separate tax-paying entities or persons. So DTA is not going to help you. So what did we help this client with? Well, firstly, we explained all of this to the client. Thereafter, they sat and they said, right, how would we want to also look at benefiting our children? And after we came up with a bit of a plan, we got the children in the room and we all sat around a table and we said, right, here's the problem. Here's some solutions. And by virtue of a conversation, the SA child said, happy to get the assets in the structure. And the offshore children said, listen, we are happy to get assets and let that rather devolve in terms of mom and dad's will. Because if you receive an inheritance offshore, there's no taxes offshore. So what we're busy with for this client is we're doing a massive rebalancing, making sure that the will reads correctly, that the offshore kids can get a equivalent value from if you think about all the assets holistically, but it all comes out of the estate of the parents, and then the SA child is basically going to get some of the assets that is in the trust. And that's where your rebalancing and equalization exercise comes in. This is the last that I want to say is estate planning. Don't let it slide. Go sit with a professional. Don't just look at your will in isolation. You have to look at all your assets, all your structures, and your family dynamics. Have the hard conversations even with your children, because you can actually make sure that there's not a massive family feud after your passing. Don't underestimate the power of a well-drafted will. Go to a professional. There's a lot of extra clauses that can be added in a will that can provide flexibility to the executor and the heirs. So don't underestimate that. And when you're doing planning, don't forget about things like a trust deed. Is your trust deed in order? Does that need to be amended? Do I need to draft letters of wishes in which I can express my wishes to the future generation? Think about that. Do you have a life file? Now, my mom had a blue file. We called it the blue file because since I was a little girl like this, she used to say to me, if something happens to me and Dad, you go to this cupboard, to the blue file, and in this blue file, there will be everything that you need. And when my mom passed away, what happened? We went to the blue file. in there was the antenuptial agreement, marriage certificate, vehicle registration certificates, title deeds, information about a medical aid gap cover, passwords. You would be amazed what you can do if you have a password to a phone and to an email address. You can really organize somebody's life if you've got those two things. For a lot of people that are owning firearms, where are you putting those firearm licenses? Get a file together, because one of the greatest gifts that you can give your loved ones is actually to make sure that your affairs are in order. And then also think with the philanthropy hat on. How can you build and then also leave a legacy for the future generations? Thank you very much for listening. And as we say in Afrikaans, fluit, fluit, my story is nou uit. Is if you have any questions. Is there any questions? Does anybody have a question that they want to ask? Well, then we don't need to have a Q&A session. There's wine and there's some snacks at the back. Please make your way there, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks.
Because they see in you what you see in yourself. Someone who will never settle for ordinary. To achieve the extraordinary, you need partners. People who will match your ambition, inspiring you to act quicker, dig deeper, and stand taller. Backing you to find a way, because they see in you what you see in yourself. Someone who will never settle for ordinary. To achieve the extraordinary, you need partners. People who will match your ambition, inspiring you to act quicker, dig deeper, and stand taller. Backing you to find a way, because they see in you what you see in yourself. Someone who will never settle for ordinary.